So welcome to Bonded Voices, Season 2, Generation X. Today we're going to be chatting with Daniel Rachel, author of a book that is a little too close to home for me, Too Much Too Young, Rude Boys, Racism, and the Soundtrack of a Generation. I'm Ian.
I'm Greg.
This is Lauren.
And Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell our audience a little bit about your book.
A little bit about myself. Oh my goodness, that's such a broad question. Well, I'm basically an author. I write books. Before that, I was a musician, which defined my life from mid-teenage years pretty much until I was almost 40. And music and literature, I guess, are the defining things in my life. Yeah.
So I've got to ask you then, what was the music and what was the band, or what was the style?
In the 90s, I was in a band called Rachel's Basement, which I was the lead singer and the songwriter. And in the 2000s, I released a couple of solo albums under my own name, and neither really did what they were supposed to do, which is why I kind of ended up writing books instead.
What was the style? Where were you at with style-wise?
Just trying to rewrite Ticket to Ride.
Oh, okay. So like a Beatle-y sort of thing. Yeah.
It wasn't. We didn't sound like the Beatles, but like most bands in the 90s, we had aspirations to try and write the great 3-minute pop song. And maybe I did in my own head.
Hey, listen, all my years in the music industry, one thing I learned was, and you've seen it with like the P. Diddy situation, it isn't all about talent. There's a lot of other factors involved in success in the music industry beyond talent, songwriting, and all that sort of stuff. So,
yeah. Well, it gave me a life. And then in the 2000s, as I say, I did a couple of solo albums, and they oddly fared better than all the time I've been in Rachel's Basement. But still, it was only ever on a kind of a grassroots level ultimately. So, but it kept me busy for 20 odd years.
So a lot of our audience are not going to know much about the two-tone movement. As I say, I lived it firsthand. It's something I look back on with very fondly. They were amazing years. So what inspired this? What inspired the writing of this book?
Well, I mean, you can't be English or British without two-tone touching you, because when it really exploded from 1979, pretty much in its heyday until mid-1981, it was the most dominant music and culture for a generation, really. It was more commercially successful than punk. It had #1 records. It sold records in the hundreds of thousands, half millions. It was really huge, and it centered around the band's specials, beat, selector, madness. And oddly enough, it's never had a book written about it in any depth. And what I wanted to do was try and attempt to provide that book that set two-tone in the socio-political climate in which it kind of fermented, and then uncover all the stories within the bands and around the record label. And it's an exciting book full of kind of great music, brilliant clothes, and then a very distraught story of racism and social inequality and misogyny, and all those factors I thought were really important to place two-tone in its rightful place within the pantheon of rock and roll history.
Absolutely. You know, it's one of those situations where I remember vividly the outrage around the Sex Pistols' "God Save the Queen" when it happened. And it made BBC News, and you could hear all these old people getting all crazy about how dare they. And you're right. English music that really dominated had political roots within the working class. and it really created movements around the country. I was telling these guys, because it's amazing for me, right? It's 2024. Until maybe the late 80s, a lot of bands could exist in England and movements could exist in England that never happened over here. They never heard of them, and the same way we never heard of them in England. It was very.
I mean, I just did a road trip of the US, and I'd only ever previously been to New York, and it really gave me an understanding of the impact Two Tone had on so many bands and musicians, particularly on the East and West Coast. And as you say, I think that really hit in the late 80s, and then continued and made an enormous mark in the 90s, and continues to do so now. In fact, the last date of the tour was in Hampton, Virginia, where they have the America's biggest ska and reggae festival, and the Selector headlined that, and it was like a coming together of all these bands and fans that love Two Tone and will recognizing its influence on what, as you Americans call, the third wave of ska. So yeah, I mean that. Yeah,
correct. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
But I would contest about this idea of it being music for working class people. I mean, I don't know where this idea grows from, but it perpetuates in all music writing, and particularly music journalism, which I have no part of. But I don't know about you, but I've never been to a gig in my life where somebody's asked me what class I belong to. So I don't know how people know or assume what an audience is. And if you've got a theatre of 2,000, 3,000 plus people, they could be of any class. And the musicians of Two Tone are across of all classes. The man who formed the Specials and had the idea of Two Tone was Jerry Dammers. Well, Jerry Dammers was middle class, and his father was of the church. Many of the musicians were working class, many were middle class, and many were upper class. And although class is something that's very different in Britain to how it is in America, it's not defined by wealth. As you well know, class in Britain is a kind of is much more like the caste system in Asia, South and Northern Asia, where it separates us out from the monarchy down, and and in time immemorial to now, class determines all. In your mannerisms, your gestures, the way you speak, where you're born, which school you went to. And it plays a critical and crucial part in understanding why Two Tone worked, but also why Two Tone exploded and imploded within itself.
Right. And we've watched a couple of your other interviews as well.
Oh, yeah.
and obviously some fascinating insights in those. For our audience, as I say, most of them are never going to understand or miss completely what Two Tone was. They probably didn't experience the Specials. I've even played, Ghost Town to people. They're like, no, never heard of it. And it's one of those movements that I think even K-Rock, which was the big alternative rock station out of Los Angeles that broke a lot of the new bands, especially British bands over here, they missed it as well. It was on the back end of there. They definitely did not play Message to You, Rudy, Gangsters, or any of those other early Two Tone records. For these guys, Greg, I'll fire it to you, because obviously you've probably got a lot of questions as someone who's, again, just been introduced to this lately.
So thank you so much, Daniel, for your time. One of the things that's very interesting for me is understanding how close from a geography point of view, this whole movement of music came from. So in the United States, Lauren and I grew up here in the States, Ian there in the UK, and then Australia, then ended up over here. So what we experienced was the grunge movement that came out of the Pacific Northwest. Bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains. But this Two Tone movement seems to be even more tightly connected to a specific part within England. And I think that's fascinating, Could you share with us a little bit of how that came about?
Yeah, I mean, what's really important for listeners to understand if they're not familiar with two-tone as a kind of a record label and as a concept is that in 70s Britain, much like the States, the idea of black and white musicians being in the same band together was pretty much unheard of, and more so as a political statement. So although you had forerunners like Sly and Family Stone coming out of Oakland, California, or you had the Equals coming out of London in Britain, this idea of the coming together of different races is all important. And that's what two-tone is going to represent, a coming together of different cultures. And the reason why that's happening is because from the Caribbean islands, which were part of the British Empire, people have been invited over to the UK, and they'd laid down their roots in different parts of the different industries in different cities in the UK. And then their first generation kids mixed with white kids, and then they shared influences, they shared clothing, they shared records, and then and all of that ended up in the style and sound of the bands they then formed in late 70s Britain, which was a mixture of kind of reggae influences and punk and rock influences. But really, those towns where that happened, whether it was London or 100 miles north in Birmingham, or then slightly over to the east, Coventry, where the two-tone bands came out of, is really why those bands happen in those different cities. And geographically, for us as Brits, they're all very, very far apart. But my knowledge of I've driven across the States in 3.5 weeks is, the distance between England and Edinburgh doesn't even get you out of New York State if you start in Manhattan. The sizes are completely different. But for us, 100 miles might as well be the difference between LA and New York. It's weeks of preparation to make that kind of a journey. So the idea that the formative two-tone bands, Specials and Selector, were from Coventry, then over on the other side, quite near Birmingham, is where the Beat were, and right down in the capital in London is where Madness and the Body Snatchers were. What the great and coincidence is that all these disparate bands and musicians within them were all being inspired by the same kind of music and the same kind of people from the Caribbean, the same kind of ideas, but without any knowledge of all the others doing it at exactly the same time. And when Jerry Dammers had this vision of a label that brought together like-minded musicians so that the Specials, when they got signed, wouldn't be the only band going forward trying to bring forward a two-tone style of music, he then went out and discovered these bands, but he didn't know who they were at the time that he got the record deal for the Specials and for Two-Tone Records.
Got it. Lauren, I'm sure you've got a question.
I was interested in how Dammer's upbringing, how did that, influence his, social consciousness that, bled into all the music?
It's kind of... I think there's a mix there because his father, as I mentioned, was of the church, and his father wrote books, and the kind of the essence of his father's writings was very much what we understand as environmentalism today. The idea of using what is in with society already and reusing clothes, not having to make or buy new ones, helping other people that are in need. And all of those definitely influenced Jerry Dammers. But then Jerry also, his own consciousness brought him to socialism. And I think ultimately his sense of injustice of how people of other races, non-white races, were being treated on the streets of Britain culminates in the single Nelson Mandela. And I'm sure all listeners here are aware of the president of South Africa, the first black president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela. Well, the Special, aka in 1984, wrote a song with the chorus line, "Free Nelson Mandela," who at that point had been in prison for 21 years and will go on to be in prison for 27 years. And I think largely that song is responsible for educating a generation as to who this person was, and culminated in two enormous concerts at Wembley Stadium and a global audience of 600 million. And that at that concert, Stevie Wonder performed, Whitney Houston performed, Annie Lennox performed, and then ultimately Nelson Mandela appeared on stage himself when the finale of the night was the song Nelson Mandela. So if you're looking for an entry point to jump into two-tone, there's probably no better song than Nelson Mandela by Special, aka.
Right. So growing up in Coventry, Coventry was a very violent place. I had friends who their Friday night out was, let's go out, get drunk, meet some girls and fight. One thing I saw through the two-tone movement and the Rude Boys, it was almost a case of they did away with any of the trappings of having to make yourself look good. Everyone's hair was pretty much cut. It was when taking no nonsense, and we're going to dress for success. I think you've pointed out before in other talks that if you're a rude boy, you look like a rude boy. If you're a mod, you look like a mod. If you're a punk, you look like a punk. There wasn't the crossover that you get today and that meld in. So within Coventry itself, did you look at all into the influence that this whole two-tone scene had on Coventry? Because Coventry was coming out of some pretty dire times. And then, I saw this where when the Specials would play in the center of Coventry, the line would wrap around the city center. It was insane how many people tried to get in. And they had probably more people outside of their gigs than inside of their gigs a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, this whole period and the whole two-tone story is full of contradictions. And one of those contradictions is that black people invariably didn't come to two-tone gigs, and that was always to the dismay of the musicians. That racist violence that had provided the catalyst for the two-tone movement didn't end. The stabbings, the killings of black people, of Asian people, persisted. The National Front, who were becoming a force politically and a threat to the prevailing order, with marches and standing candidates at the general election, they didn't go away. And the Specials begin by doing gigs to try and unite black and white kids, and ends with them doing benefit concerts, because there's been more murders in Coventry, as there had been, not just in the violence of Coventry was being replicated across the whole of the United Kingdom. But at the same time, two-tone was affecting kids like me who was 10, 11, 12 while this was all happening, who were looking for an identity and something to join. Yeah. And we were being lured at football and at our school gates by neo-Nazis and fascists like the National Front to go and join them. And at the same time, being attracted by this brilliant music that was suggesting that the way forward was a harmony of black and white. So it's contradiction all the way along. And I think it's the contradiction that actually gives the book my book, Too Much Too Young, a kind of a grit and a narrative that really drives it beyond just here are some bands and here are some records. There's a genuine kind of narrative to be told about the political struggle that this music was trying to survive within and reflect.
Do you think there's been any lasting cultural effect of two-tone? And I'm asking this semi-knowing the answer, having, as I say, spent so much time growing up there and going back all the way to my mother's funeral, and even Coventry being voted most cultural city in England about 3-4 years ago, which was kind of mind-boggling to me. But do you think that there was any lasting cultural effect from the two-tone movement on Coventry or that surrounding area, you know, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, that sort of place?
Well, I think two-tone was bigger than a small city like Coventry, which only had 350,000 people, or Wolverhampton, which was smaller still. Two-tone, I think, was never trying to be small-minded or small and about a small town. It was about a global idea that was to bring to elevate women so they had an equitable status in the world, to try and bring a harmonious relationship by black and white kids. And I think the effect of that is that these bands are still playing. I mean, even if you're saying that audiences in the States haven't heard of some of these bands or even two-tone itself, the music is still evidently lasting in the US. I mean, Madness have just come back, having played to audiences of between 5,000 and 10,000 people on the West Coast. And although they're only known for Our House there, and maybe It Must Be Love if people know a little bit more about music, as a novelty band, that's a big audience to play to.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
In the UK, they just had a #1 album. The Selector headlined the biggest ska and reggae festival in the US, as I just mentioned, in Virginia. The English Beat continue to perform across the state. So there's a relevance of these bands to audiences today. But I think most importantly, the records are still selling, and they're now issuing them as 40th anniversary, this and that and the other. But in terms of the greater desire of two-tone, we don't think anything of black and white people being in bands together now, and that's huge.
Yeah.
So, you know, Rihanna just did not just, it was 15 years ago, she released a song called Rude Boy. Is that, bringing that genre forward again? Do you think?
I don't know. She's probably talking about the boyfriend that was smashing her head in against in the car and kicking her out, and the domestic abuse that she suffered, I would imagine. Whether she was talking about the original Jamaican rude boy who carried a knife and was violent in 60s Jamaica, well, that would be an apt parallel story in Rihanna's life, So I don't know. You'd have to ask about. I don't know the song, but it sounds good to me.
Daniel, you really just triggered me with something. Is that the root of the term rude boy? Did it come out of Jamaica with like a knife carrying youth?
Yeah, 100%. And it was they were the bane of Kingston life, and they weren't people to be applauded. And the irony of two-tone is that when you said earlier that Britain was made up of tribal groups, so the Pistols and the Clash had the punks and the Jam had the mods. Well, Jerry Dammers thought, as two-tone, we need our tribe. So he introduced the concept of the rude boy, knowing full well its history, but to young British kids, we had no idea. And then immediately they then decided to cover the Jamaican song, A Message to You, Rudy. And it was like, you become rude boys, but now we're going to tell you off. Behave yourself. This is a message to you. It's like, hang on, I didn't know we were troublemakers. But that was the root of the rude boy, yeah. And then by dint of the way she dressed, Pauline Black, the lead singer of The Selector, was the first rude girl. But it was just a way to dress and give yourself to belong to a tribal group,
Because it was a fear of mine in my youth in Coventry being stabbed. It was like if you got into a fight, even into a crowd, at soccer games at different areas, all of a sudden people would be bleeding because someone would just come along and just rake you with a knife.
Yeah, I mean that's what Concrete Jungle by the Specials, Roddy Radiation song is all about, knife violence.
It's amazing. And I always grew up with the idea of like I'd rather be shot than stabbed. Seeing some of that stuff, because it
The
was
lesser of two evils.
the stabbings were brutal. They were really brutal, and you'd see people, if you ever went to Coventry's emergency room on a Saturday, which we did quite a bit, 4 boys in my family. The people in there who were stabbed or slashed, it was pretty brutal, because they wouldn't be treated immediately. I mean, you'd have people with a knife sticking out of them waiting to be seen. Like that's the type of crazy violence that we used to see in Coventry.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, it's very typical, I mean, Two Tone centered on that kind of violence, and that's male violence, and that's violence that exists in Britain today and exists in the States. And the lesser, and the greater violence is, of course, violence against women. And that's why there was the song "The Boiler" that was which was one of the most important records ever released on the Two Tone label, which was about male violence and then rape. And the last minute of the song is the lead singer screaming because she is being raped.
Yeah.
And still today, that issue is the lesser talked about subject, because men find it more difficult to talk about or want to skirt the issue. So that instead we talk about gun violence and knife violence, which is no less a crime. But all I'm saying is that there's an equal epidemic that was existing in society then as it is today.
Well, the sexual evils in the music industry, just with what you're seeing with Diddy's thing, is just the tip of the iceberg. When I was in the music industry, it was both in like the gay mafia within the music industry, like sexual violence on young men, and the type of coercion and sexual violence towards women has been constant in the music industry.
Yes.
Way more than people ever knew about it. And it's kind of interesting that, you have these people on MTV and everything thought, well, let's protect women at the same time they go into parties where women are being raped for 48 hours straight.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy. So, Greg, back to the book.
So this whole two-tone movement has been fascinating for me to learn more about. Could you encapsulate what's the message? Because it's not an angst message. It's not an angry message. Although the music at times could appear to be edgy, and some of the clothing maybe a little edgy, but two questions. How do you define two-tone to the individual from a band point of view? And how do we point people to get your book?
Well, the two-tone was Jerry Dammers' idea for two-tone was to be very much like Tamla Motown. And in as much as if you hear a Motown track, you know straight away within the first beats of the bar, the crash of the snare drum, that it's a Motown song. And so two-tone had a very similar identifying sound. And that sound had its base in the music of Jamaica in the 1960s and early 70s. But it also mixed through with elements of disco, funk, rock, and particularly punk. And it was very angry music, but it had a joyous backbeat. So it was much more like Motown of the late 60s, early 70s, where it was addressing social issues. Whether it's the Supremes talking about a child born out of marriage, or what Marvin Gaye was talking about and what's going on, or those kind of songs. It addressed with an anger society, not owning up and looking at itself the issues that were there in front of them. So the book is trying to it takes you as the reader through everything that I guess you're asking. What was it? How did it come about? Who did it affect? Who were the bands? Who was the makeup of the bands? Why was it successful? Why did it fall in on itself? Who were the characters? And, thankfully, from my point of view, after a British publication, it then got picked up by Akashic, who are publishers in Brooklyn. And they've done a US version that was released in the States in April this year, which is why I came over and did a 12-day tour just. So as long as Akashic have done their job, then it's everywhere, from online to bookstores throughout. And I can vouch for seeing it in San Francisco and Las Vegas and New York and Denver and cities all over the States. So you can certainly find it. It's a chunky book. It's got some great, color photographs and also the identifying artwork of both the bands and the label, and hopefully it's kind of a deep dive that gives you a social political history of Britain in the 70s. All the bands came over to the States in the 80s, so you get to meet the Go-Go's who played with these bands. You come across figures like Talking Heads, support slots by REM. The Bangles, these kind of American people figure in the story because it unlocks some of the racism that the two-tone bands were confronted with when they came to the US, and the final tour by the Specials in North America in late 1981 is an American story. So there's lots of transatlantic reference points that I hope American buyers will understand and be drawn to.
Daniel, Rachel, thank you so much. This is a book, again, Too Much Too Young. It's in bookstores everywhere. Go out and get a copy. Learn about there's something from music history that as Americans you may not have seen if you listen to us internationally, maybe something even closer to home. I know we've even got listeners back in my hometown of Coventry where this emanated out of. It's a phenomenal, and I want to thank you for actually putting this book together because it's a moment in time that should never be lost. It's really important that we understand history and the machinations of everything that happened in and around that. So again, thank you so much for joining us on Bonded Voices. I'm Ian.
I'm Greg.
This is Lauren.
And Daniel, thank you
very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Daniel.